All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to explore how a beautiful, incredibly short-lived spring tulip actually connects modern garden design to a pivotal moment in 18th century Ottoman history. We are essentially bridging two completely different worlds, a practical horticultural guide on one hand and a scholarly architectural history on the other, just to uncover this fascinating, almost poetic logic that's shared by both everyday gardeners and historical scholars. Now, I know what you're thinking. What on earth do modern garden design and 18th century Ottoman architecture actually have in common? It sounds like a total trick question, right? But this question really sets up our entire journey today. It introduces this fascinating, shared challenge that both gardeners and emperors have had to face, managing a spectacular, yet ultimately fleeting, visual display. Because whether you're planting a massive bed of spring flowers or engineering a magnificent new royal visual regime, the core problem is exactly the same. How do you sustain that magic when the initial bloom inevitably starts to fade?
Well, let's look at the garden first. Imagine you plant a big bag of spring bulbs, your tulips or your daffodils. If you just plant them all by themselves, they look absolutely incredible for a few weeks. Sure, but then they look a little lonely. And worse, when they finish blooming, their leaves turn brown and the plant goes dormant. It's not a great look. So to create a balanced garden, our source explains that you have to carefully stage a continuous visual show. It's basically a three-step process. You plant your star bulbs, you add companion plants that bloom at the exact same time to boost the show, and, here is the crucial part, you plant specific species whose entire job is to actively camouflage that dying foliage later on.
So, the strategy behind these companion plants unfolds into two totally distinct phases. First up, you've got the plants that share the stage. We're talking early flowering shrubs like azaleas, or maybe a glowing blanket of creeping phlox, which bloom right alongside the tulips to create this massive explosion of spring color. But phase two? That's where the real tactical work happens. Once those tulips are spent, you desperately need your foliage-hiding companions. These are plants like catmint, daylilies, and hostas. They emerge late and basically take over the visual real estate, completely masking those browning, dormant leaves underneath.
It's honestly pretty brilliant and kind of funny, the sheer lengths we go to just to hide a few ground leaves to maintain a pristine image. Take daylilies. Their strappy leaves perfectly mimic the dying leaves of daffodils, acting like literal visual camouflage. Meanwhile, some of the larger hostas unfurl these massive broad leaves that work like physical umbrellas, completely hiding the spent bulbs from view. And hey, there's a functional benefit here too. These companion plants soak up all that excess summer moisture in the soil, which actually prevents the dormant bulbs from rotting. It's a highly specific horticultural tactic, but it ensures the garden's visual power is never compromised.
Okay, so let's shift gears and jump back to 1703 to see how this connects to our historical narrative. Meet Ottoman Sultan Ahmed III. He came to power right after a massive Janissary rebellion completely unseated his predecessor. The rebels had a major demand. The new sultan had to return to Istanbul and make himself and his sovereignty visible to the people. For centuries, Ottoman sultans had been largely secluded, tucked away like semi-sacred figures behind high palace walls. But Ahmed III faced a huge problem of display. He had to engineer an entirely new visual regime to maintain his authority and basically pacify the public. Just like a gardener trying to create a spectacular spring show, Ahmed III needed to flood his capital with new, highly visible architectural blooms.
Take the Fountain of Sultan Ahmed III, for example, built in 1728. Its prominent location right between the Hagia Sophia and the imperial gate of the Topkapi Palace is absolutely key here. This was not hidden away in some private courtyard. This was unprecedented, highly accessible public splendor. It featured a totally novel form, incredible scale, and was covered in naturalistic floral carvings. Architecture like this fountain became the central tool for promoting the Sultan's power through public visibility, ultimately transforming the social and physical structure of Istanbul.
And this whole obsession with highly visible beauty, it wasn't just about buildings. It permeated the entire culture. The poetry of the era absolutely ate this up, capturing this lavish bloom perfectly. The renowned poet Nidim wrote lines praising the newly built Sadabad Palace and its magnificent silver canal, proclaiming it quite literally had no equal in the world. The vocabulary used by poets during this time was entirely focused on novelty and uniqueness. They celebrated things that were never before seen, praising the earthly beauties and sensual delights of this rapidly changing urban landscape. For the first time, man-made architecture was being written about as if it were just as delightful and heavenly as nature itself.
You can actually see this explosion of culture meticulously documented in works like Levny's Miniature, which details a massive 15-day circumcision festival. You really get a sense of the sheer pomp and public spectacle of the court. The elites began displaying their wealth through conspicuous consumption like never before. Lady Mary Montagu, a British ambassador's wife at the time, even noted that the Ottoman royal women wore more jewels than any European queen. Because of this massive obsession with novelty, art, and elaborate gardens, later historians would actually go back and anachronistically name this era the Tulip period. It really was a magnificent, unprecedented historical bloom.
But, just like our spring tulips, this spectacular Ottoman era eventually faded. In 1730, the whole thing came to an abrupt, pretty violent end with another massive rebellion. Those beautiful waterfront palaces began to decay, the political landscape shifted, and just like that, the tulip period was over. And what it left behind was a highly complex hybrid legacy that later historians had to somehow deal with. And this is exactly where our two sources, the Gardening Guide and the Architectural History, collide in a really fascinating way.
Here is the crucial parallel. In the garden, when a bloom dies, it leaves behind ugly, browning foliage that ruins the aesthetic. So, what do gardeners do? They plant hostas to camouflage it. In history, when an era's legacy conflicts with a new political ideology, historians use ideological companion plants to camouflage the truth. Our source details how early 20th century Turkish Republican historians looked back at the Tulip period and found its pluralistic, lavish, and hybrid nature totally unacceptable for their new, purely nationalist narrative. So, they just completely obscured the true nature of the era.
You can see exactly how this ideological camouflage played out in the rhetoric of the time. Impartially looking at the sources, in 1934, a writer named Zia vehemently condemned the Tulip period. He claimed that foreign diplomats and cosmopolitan artists basically stabbed a scalpel into the chest of pure Turkish art. Remember that beautiful fountain of Sultan Ahmed III we discussed earlier? Zia completely dismisses it, calling it a corrupted departure from classical Ottoman traditions, ruined by Persian and European influences. For these early Republican thinkers, the era wasn't a magnificent bloom at all. It was a symbol of corruption and the start of the empire's decline.
Fortunately, recent scholars have stepped in, acting a bit like careful landscapers, right? They're pulling back that thick historical camouflage. The shift in historiography is stark. The early Republican view basically defined the 18th century by corruption, blind Westernization, and a departure from pure Ottoman nobility. But the modern scholarly view, based on revised historical research, reveals something entirely different. They argue that the Tulip period wasn't just a decay of classical norms, but actually a vibrant, vital era of genuine early modernity, defined by incredible novelty, urban experimentation, and social evolution.
Because when you actually strip away that nationalistic rhetoric that covered up the past, the primary sources show us an era of profound social transformation. The real story of the Tulip period is about the decentralization of state power. It's about the rise of brand new public spaces like coffee shops, public squares, and those monumental fountains that fundamentally changed how citizens interacted with each other. It was a time of new social mobility, where the middle class and the elites began to share the exact same urban spaces, and economic practices transformed to support a rising global market. The architecture was really just the visual evidence of a rapidly modernizing society.
It's honestly wild to think about how much a historical narrative can be actively shaped by the people who come after it, meticulously pruning and hiding the parts of the past they just don't want us to see. So I want to leave you with this final thought. If it takes deliberate effort to uncover the vibrant early modernity of the Ottoman Tulip period from beneath decades of ideological camouflage, how many other historical periods have been completely masked by the ideological foliage of the historians who came after them? What else is just waiting to be uncovered in the garden of our history?